Tonight on Nova. In the decades following the first atomic bomb, neighbors of weapons plants were kept in the dark about potential dangers.
Anything that we saw that was odd that we would call in and ask about, they'd say it was swamp gas floating through the night sky, or don't talk about it, it's a national security secret, and we always lived like that.
Cancer, thyroid disease, and nuclear waste that will cost billions to clean up have finally forced our government to take stock of the bomb's lethal legacy.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
August 4th, 1989. Connell, Washington. The high school class of 1969 is holding its 20th reunion. It's a chance to see some old friends and share a few memories. Unfortunately, a shadow hangs over this reunion. A shadow cast by a nearby nuclear weapons plant and reflected in the presence of a scientific team from the Centers for Disease Control.
One of the things we're interested in is learning a little bit about what you all know about your early diet, and particularly about whether you can remember the amount of milk you consumed as kids.
Though the questions are about diet, everyone knows the real issue is thyroid disease and cancer. Almost everyone who grew up in Connell in the late 40s and early 50s is at risk for these illnesses, thanks to that nearby nuclear weapons plant, which showered the town and scores of other area communities with radioactive iodine-131, a known cause of thyroid problems, particularly dangerous to the young. All told, 20,000 children may have been exposed. Disease and cancer is part of the unacknowledged legacy of nuclear weapons production. But it is only part. 40 years of making bombs has also produced billions of gallons of deadly radioactive and toxic wastes. It has left land and groundwater so contaminated it will not be safe again for thousands of years. The responsibility for this rests with the Department of Energy and its predecessor, the Atomic Energy Commission. The DOE spends $9 billion a year and employs over 100,000 people working at 17 different facilities making and maintaining nuclear bombs. These facilities play an important role in our national defense, yet increasingly they are themselves seen as threats, at least to public health and safety. In South Carolina, DOE nuclear reactors have been shut down as unsafe. In Ohio, neighbors of a DOE uranium handling facility have won a $70 million settlement from the department over health issues. And in Colorado, the FBI is investigating possible criminal violations of federal toxic waste laws at the plant that produces bomb triggers. Today, the business of making bombs is plagued with safety issues, health concerns, and environmental problems. Nowhere is this more evident than at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State. From its beginnings, Hanford's contribution to the nation's nuclear weapons program has been the production of plutonium, the most essential ingredient in today's nuclear bombs. 9 nuclear reactors were built here. In them, nuclear fission turned a small portion of each uranium fuel rod into plutonium. In buildings like this, the plutonium was then chemically extracted in a 30-stage process that also produced vast quantities of radioactive waste, much of which has been dumped into the ground.
Hanford, without question, is probably the most contaminated site in North America, and maybe one of the most contaminated sites in the world, depending on what we find out about the Soviet program. During the course of its operation, the facility was responsible for producing roughly half of all the plutonium in the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But in producing that plutonium, it has amassed enormous amounts of fantastically dangerous radioactive and toxic elements. For example, since the 40s, about 200 billion gallons of contaminated liquids, contaminated with radioactive and toxic materials, have been dumped directly into the soil at the site. This is enough to create a lake the size of Manhattan, 40 feet deep.
Today, the sagebrush and tumbleweed on parts of the 570 square mile Hanford Reservation are radioactive. So are jackrabbits and rattlesnakes. So is much of the soil, and groundwater that passes through that soil is slowly carrying radioactivity to the Columbia River. For millions of people, from Hanford all the way to Portland on the coast, this river is a source of drinking water, food, and recreation. In 1942, when scientists needed a place to produce plutonium for the first atomic bombs, Hanford was chosen because of its access to water and power, and because it's a long way from anywhere. Fears that the world's first nuclear reactors might explode could not be dismissed. Construction on the super-secret project began in March of 1943. Almost overnight, Hanford became the third largest city in the state, as tens of thousands of workers, recruited from all over the country, arrived at the site. None of them knew what the enormous facilities they were building would be used for. Determined to be the first to produce an atomic weapon, American scientists had pushed themselves and the fields of physics and chemistry to unprecedented heights. That hard-won knowledge was converted at Hanford into facilities that it was hoped would turn theoretical possibilities into realities. At virtually every turn, unique technical challenges were encountered. For instance, the high radioactivity anticipated in the chemical plants required all work be done remotely. To get people used to working this way, final construction was done remotely as well. Working directly under General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, was Colonel Franklin Matthias.
Everything we had to build was new. Nothing had ever been built like it before. And new controls, new everything.
And all of it to the finest of tolerances. For example, all these graphite blocks for the reactors had to be identical to within thousandths of an inch. Nevertheless, the first reactor was completed and ready to start in the remarkable time of 15 months.
We set it in motion to start generating heat and start generating plutonium. And the operation went along. We very gradually increased the loading through the control rods that we had built into the system. And about the second day, we were up to about a third of the load that was anticipated. And the whole thing started backing up, and we couldn't, through the controls or anything else, make it go any higher.
The reactor design had always been a gamble. At that point, it looked like a $350 million failure. After a day or two of quiet panic, physicists Enrico Fermi and John Wheeler determined that a decay product of uranium was poisoning the reaction. They also realized the reactor as designed was too small to overcome this effect. Fortunately, it hadn't been built to the scientists' specifications. Engineers from DuPont, which built the reactor, had allowed room for additional fuel rods, on the chance, as one of them put it, that the long hairs had missed.
I don't think I ever heard a DuPont guy say, "I told you so," but I bet a lot of them felt it. But anyhow, it saved the plutonium program. I think we would have been out of business go home and fire everybody and think of some other way to win the war.
Within weeks, irradiated fuel rods were being pushed out of the back of the reactor and collected for plutonium extraction. Within a year, plutonium was fueling atomic explosions at Los Alamos and then over Japan. With the dropping of the bomb, Hanford's secret was out of the bag, and the atomic age began. Whether or not it would someday resemble the world depicted in such popular 1930s diversions as Flash Gordon remained to be seen.
The control of radioactive energy here is great enough to conquer the universe, which I intend to do with your aid, Sarkoff.
Even before the war, films like this had helped polarize public opinion about things atomic. It wasn't difficult. Both the dangers and benefits of radioactivity were often exaggerated and widely misunderstood. What we now know is that while most atoms are stable, others, called radionuclides, have structures that are out of balance. These radionuclides continually undergo a process of change called decay to try to achieve a more stable form. As they do, they release energy or atomic particles, radiation. There are basically 4 types of radiation: alpha and beta particles, neutrons, and gamma rays. Their ability to penetrate solids varies from type to type, as does the ability to transmit energy. Because of this, different precautions are taken when dealing with different types of radiation. The cesium-137 in this stainless steel capsule is kept under 20 feet of water because it's a potent gamma ray emitter. Without such shielding, the gamma rays could easily pass through a human body, causing internal organ damage. This plutonium, on the other hand, is an alpha emitter. Alpha particles are not very penetrating, and a rubber glove provides adequate protection. However, if the particles are ingested or inhaled, they are extremely deadly, even in small quantities. When radiation strikes an atom or molecule inside a living cell, electrons are knocked out of their shells, leaving incomplete atoms or ions. When this happens to an atom within a gene, it alters the genetic information carried there. This can result in cancer, disease, or genetic defects.
You only need to hit one cell. And what is the hit? It's the radiation is going to tear away a little bit of that cell because it's too energetic. It dislodges the cell when it's dividing. It's only going to be dangerous if the hit comes when it's dividing. And it's 9 times out of 10 doesn't matter because the body's very good at recovering these things. But the 10th time, the rogue cell tucks its way into the tissue, stays there, and then something turns in its favor and you get a cancer after a long interval. But it only needed that one bad, unlucky day to get it.
Because every exposure to radiation carries some risk, people who work with radioactive materials take precautions to minimize the doses they receive. Over the years, the government's definition of an acceptable level of risk has been reduced. Still, some radiologists argue the standard remains too high. In the 40s and 50s, however, at Hanford and elsewhere, the issue of radiation exposure was overshadowed by other concerns.
With the knowledge that the Russians had developed an atomic bomb and then subsequent to that a hydrogen bomb, the Cold War arms race actually got its start. So starting up again in the late 40s, early 50s, Hanford went on a growth program where the original 3 reactors that had been built here during World War II were added to. 5 additional reactors were built in the 50s. And also the Atomic Energy Commission started a new production complex for nuclear material at Savannah River. So Hanford was very much in a boom period during the 1950s, early 1960s, as the Cold War and arms race really got underway.
This boom occurred behind closed doors. The Atomic Energy Commission, which ran the nation's nuclear program, operated behind a cloak of secrecy, justified by national security. This veil was drawn even tighter in 1954 with passage of the Atomic Energy Act, which exempted the AEC from compliance with all federal, state, and local environmental statutes. At the time, this did not seem unwise. People trusted atomic scientists. After all, they'd ended the war. This attitude was certainly common in southeastern Washington state.
As a neighbor, we never paid any attention to Hanford, really. Anything that we saw that was odd or strange that we would call in and ask about, they'd say it was swamp gas floating through the night sky, or don't talk about it, it's a national security secret, and we always lived like that. When they'd drive in the driveway and ask for specimens of dead animals, or they'd pick up the dead ducks and geese or chickens and take samples from our vegetable garden and milk samples and water samples from our wells, which they do routinely. They'd say, we're monitoring to make sure you're safe. And we said, well, what are you finding? Is there anything there? No, if there's anything there, we'll send you a letter and let you know. We never received any letter, any polite correspondence at all into all these decades.
Public support for places like Hanford remained strong through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In the 1980s, however, things began to change. 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl sensitized some. The politics surrounding efforts to site a nuclear dump at Hanford upset a few more. But the biggest shock came in February of 1986, when, under pressure from citizen groups, the Department of Energy released almost 19,000 pages of once classified Hanford history. These documents seemed to confirm everyone's worst fear. Hanford had indeed been a more dangerous place to work or live near than had ever been acknowledged. Radiology specialist Al Conklin's first assignment when he came to work for the state of Washington after 10 years at Hanford was to examine these documents. When he did, he discovered Hanford's plutonium processing plants had routinely released enormous amounts of radioactivity to the air, soil, and water. In Hanford's first decade, 470,000 curies of iodine-131 escaped up the stacks at plants like this. 15 curies were released during America's worst commercial nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island.
I was amazed, and I have to admit, I was appalled at the magnitude of the releases that occurred. I felt it bothered me that not only that the releases occurred, but that having worked at Hanford for so long, I didn't know about them. And as I reviewed the documents, I found several instances where they did consider notifying the public, but they didn't want anyone to know what was happening. And the second reason that I saw throughout several of the documents was they did not want to panic the public. So they never did notify them. So you have the downwinders that naturally feel betrayed because no one ever told them that they were being contaminated.
Not only were they contaminated by routine production practices, there were even occasions when radioactivity was released intentionally. One of the largest public exposures came from an experiment called the Green Run. While details are still classified, it was apparently an attempt to track airborne radioactivity. But by keeping it a secret, no one downwind took the simple precautions, like staying indoors and not eating vegetables from the garden, that would have minimized their exposure.
I'm not a scientist, and I don't pretend to be, and I'm not a doctor, I'm not an educated person. But I can read, and some of the things I'm reading tell a horrible story about a whole group of individuals, the downwinders, that have been used without consent by the scientific community of this nation as human guinea pigs. And it keeps pointing more and more to that area, and personally I resent that. Had they have asked me, I might have volunteered if I knowed it would have stopped communism. But not having asked me makes me angry and makes me question, who are these people? Who the hell do they think they are that they can do this?
To date, scientific proof that the Green Run or any other Hanford release has resulted in cancer and disease has not been established. Clearly, many of Hanford's neighbors are convinced such a link exists.
All my father's brothers have had cancer. My father's had cancer. My mother's had cancer. My father's sister died of cancer. My mother's parents both died of cancer. My father's parents both died of cancer. My two sisters have had multiple cancer surgeries. We just thought everybody was the same way, even though the new people that came in the 50s, the second generation downwinders, those children were healthy. But it's interesting to look at the second generation downwinders that came from all over the nation and their health, 30-some years later after having lived here. And out of 28 of the neighbors, 27 of those households have been affected with cancer, early heart disease, or handicapped children. You could blame herbicides or pesticides, but when I was in Texas, I didn't find these health effects in that same population base. And they were going to put a waste dump down there, and they asked me to come down and tell them what it was like living around Hanford. And I had an audience of about 140 to 150 people. And I said, I'm real curious. How many of you in this audience have ever had thyroid cancer, thyroid problems, or take thyroid medication, or have a member of the family that have? Not one hand went up. Not one. And in my community here, it's just a common problem here. But in Hereford, Texas, where they use the same farm chemicals that we use, grow the same crops, put the same medicine on the cattle, they had no thyroid problems. And at that time, I ran cold inside because I knew I was different than other American citizens. I knew I was different. I knew our entire community was different.
We don't keep health records on the people off-site. We do have medical records from the counties, and the state has an opportunity to look at them. And those people do have fears that they have been adversely affected by the operations of the Hanford site. But the work that's been done to date, the reviews of that data to date by the state epidemiologist and others, do not show any abnormalities. So yes, there is a potential for great harm from the Hanford site, but if you look at the record objectively over the years, I think our record has been very, very good.
I represent that age group that were babies, essentially, during the 1940s.
Tired of having their stories dismissed as anecdotal evidence, many Hanford area residents began organizing.
Put us at high risk. And now the passage of time and our degenerating health has revealed that we are indeed unsuspecting victims of America's nuclear...
They pushed hard to get an independent scientific review of the impacts on public health of past radiation releases. And in early 1989, Congress responded by funding an epidemiology study to be conducted by the Centers for Disease Control.
The community has a question. And it's a valid question, and the preliminary data that we have suggests that we might be able to answer the question scientifically. I'm a physician with the Centers for Disease.
Using an informal network of school groups, Ruttenberg hopes to find 2,000 of the 20,000 children exposed to radioactive iodine-131 in the late 40s and early 50s. Because iodine concentrates in the thyroid, these individuals will be examined and compared to a control group to see if a statistically significant cluster of thyroid illness can be identified. Then he'll look to see if the highest rates of cancer correspond with the highest exposures. The study will take 5 years. In the meantime, the DOE has decided to do its own study.
How about down around Walla Walla? Yeah. These irrigated areas would be relatively uncontaminated from the point of view of river water, and so we're more interested in...
The Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project is an attempt to determine just how much radiation was released by Hanford and to identify all the pathways through which it could reach people.
Okay, so these are the...
Morning, Shirley. Oh, good morning, John. I'd like to spend some time today reading classic...
The effort will incorporate such diverse data sources as classified and public historical records, old weather patterns, and detailed interviews with residents.
We're talking about how much was released, over what period of time was it released, to what environmental medium was it released. Once it gets out, where does it go? How does it accumulate in water or food products, or what were the concentrations in air? And then the next step is to figure out the consumption or exposure to individuals. From that point, we can estimate what the risk from that exposure might be.
The Dose Reconstruction Project and the CDC study should tell area residents the extent to which their health was put at risk by Hanford. But other important questions will remain unanswered. For example, how and why releases like these were allowed to occur. and why waste management decisions were made that guaranteed parts of Hanford would remain contaminated for thousands of years. The search for answers to these questions takes us back to the early days of the atomic age.
The production of nuclear weapons and the research and development that went into producing nuclear weapons provided employment for thousands and thousands of scientists over the years. In effect, the physicists became the kings of the scientific community because of this magic ability of unlocking the enormous energy contained in the atoms of plutonium and uranium metal.
After the war, nuclear physics was a hot field, but one dominated by the AEC, which, responding to Cold War pressure, demanded absolute secrecy from all its employees. The purpose was to keep information from the Soviets, but a heavy price was paid.
Science becomes corrupted when it loses its accountability to the society. And this is precisely what I think has happened with our nuclear weapons program.
The Atomic Energy Commission felt that this was our business, it was national security, everybody else but out. And I think the scientists shared that profoundly anti-democratic idea.
Because the system was so closed, because of the fear of secrets getting out, not only to the Soviets, but to our own people, the scientific community within the nuclear weapons bureaucracy became more and more functionaries for policies that were not quite that scientific. They became functionaries justifying practices such as dumping billions of gallons of waste every year into the soils. They became functionaries justifying outdated waste management practices involving pouring waste into tanks and ditches.
Case in point, Herbert Parker, manager of the Hanford Works, told Congress in 1959 that the use of steel tanks for storage of high-level liquid waste could be continued indefinitely. Yet 6 months earlier, 35,000 gallons had leaked out of just such a tank. Parker never mentioned this incident or a study done 6 years earlier by the U.S. Geological Survey, which questioned the tank's durability. In fact, this USGS study remained classified for over a decade. What the AEC did tell the American people was that the Commission was working hard to assure everything was under control.
One of the foremost considerations of the Atomic Energy Commission is the safety of these people who work and live in cities near atomic plants. Therefore, waste material which might be potentially dangerous must be removed and stored safely. This work is vitally important.
In addition to films like this, the AEC produced scientific papers on everything from waste disposal to health effects of radiation. Yet few of these papers were the products of an unfettered pursuit of the truth.
One can detect signs of their being told, please do so-and-so and so-and-so, and give us the results. And then what is published comes from there. And this, I'm sure there's never been any fudging. This has been done honorably and well. But a more inquiring mind might say, now, doesn't this naturally lead to some other study? And those have never been done, so the world's been left with a false impression of what I could only describe as rather half-baked data. It's true as far as it goes, but it's missed the whole point.
This 1955 issue of the Scientific Monthly carried an article by AEC scientist Gordon Dunning. In it, he wrote no known exposure to radioiodine-131 had ever produced detectable effects. Yet Dunning was clearly focused on the short term and completely ignored the possibility of long-term effects like cancer, thereby creating the impression that radioiodine was less harmful than it is.
It's kind of like a religion. They develop a mindset. Radiation is not harmful. Everything is safe. You hear it. It's almost like mantras coming out of these people. And when there's no one there to sort of say, what about this or what about that, the people inside the system tend to believe this. It becomes a belief system. It isn't science, it becomes a belief system. And that is a form of corruption of science. In fact, perhaps one of the more dangerous forms of corruption of science.
Remember that the primary mission of the Hanford Reservation has been to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. That was the primary mission. Even though safety was an important aspect of our job, it was always stressed to us that our work involving the protection of the environment and that sort of thing was important, but should not significantly impact the primary mission of the reservation.
When mistakes were made in the production of bombs, those mistakes were detected and corrected. That's how you do good science. You recognized your errors. Errors are an important part of science. They happen, you recognize them, that's how you fix it. When errors happened in the environmental area, leaking high-level waste tanks, the concept of storage in tanks was never critically examined. The message was that this is not important. This is not an important goal. We have to produce the biggest bang for the buck, the most bombs as cheaply as possible.
It's difficult for me to put myself in the shoes of my predecessors and say what was going through their minds when it came to waste management practices in the 40s and the 50s. But it's my guess that they felt they were being very, very responsible. I've been impressed to the degree that they did look towards environmental protection and waste management practices. Lord knows if they hadn't have done what they did, single shell tanks, soil column disposal, we would have a much, much greater and more severe cleanup problem than we do today.
The fact remains, the search for a better solution to this problem was never a top AEC priority.
And even when efforts were made, for example, at Hanford in the late 1950s, to go to a more reasonable and responsible way to manage these wastes, and Congress had allocated money to do that, they simply transferred the money over to speed up production of the Hanford N reactor without blinking an eye. And this attitude of, we'll deal with it later, became institutionalized for over 40 years.
The bad science which has characterized environment and health problems in the U.S. nuclear establishment are not peculiar to it. They have happened globally. They've happened in the Soviet Union, for instance. We now know that they had a tremendous disaster in Kishtim in 1957, where a waste tank exploded out of really sheer negligence and not caring about the conditions in that tank, even though they knew that cooling coils have failed. Two somewhat different political systems, but within those systems, you had a nuclear establishment that was very similar, which put a very clear priority on bomb production and not on environment and health and safety, and which also had operated in secrecy. When you put these two things together, you have essentially conditions which inevitably would produce bad science.
And bad science has a way of catching up with you. In the last few years at DOE sites nationwide, problems in the health, safety, and environmental areas have brought weapons production to a standstill. To many, it appeared the DOE was taking the nation to the brink of unplanned, unilateral nuclear disarmament. In January 1989, President Bush nominated Admiral James Watkins to become Secretary of Energy. His mandate was to turn the department around.
I've learned enough about the defense program side of the Department of Energy just in the past few weeks to know that there is an urgent need to effect a significant change in its deeply embedded 35-year culture. By use of the word culture, I mean that set of values that permeates the work atmosphere within which operations take place. The DOE culture has evolved from such heavy emphasis on achieving defense production goals, made within an atmosphere of collegial secrecy, that problems relating to safety, health, and the environment have not only been backlogged to intolerable levels, but in effect hidden from public view until recently. So we are now playing with the price for this long-term cultural misdirection.
Watkins said all the right things and was confirmed unanimously. The question remained, could one man change a culture so deeply ingrained? Hanford's critics certainly remained skeptical, and much of their skepticism was focused on the Hanford Dose Reconstruction Project.
Okay, did you have it go out a stack or was it a ground level? It's probably a stack.
No, I had a 10-meter.
The Department of Energy is funding this study, and this raises questions about researcher independence and objectivity. These concerns are heightened by the fact Pacific Northwest Laboratories, the independent research institution actually doing the work, depends on the DOE for 80% of its income.
Well, there is a problem with letting and giving money to the Energy Department and its contractors to do the studies that will tell us and them what the effects, the health effects and environmental effects are of their operations. There's just a clear conflict of interest. It sounds crass, but it's a little bit like letting the Hells Angels govern affairs on California highways. Now, there can be apologias about past behavior to the end of time. What they really need to do is ask somebody independent of these agencies to do the study and fund them well enough to do it well. That's not such a hard request at this stage in this debate.
We are involved in...
The DOE's response was to hire a panel of outside experts to direct the study without interference. John Till, chairman of the panel, bristles at the suggestion that this panel is in any way incumbent on the department that created it.
Don't put me in the DOE culture. Don't put me in the same framework as a DOE employee or a DOE contractor. I'm an independent scientist, and my answer is my own. I don't have anybody to answer to but to John Till, and I speak for myself and I speak for this technical steering panel. And we put our professional reputations on the line in carrying out this work.
Nevertheless, reassuring the public of the panel's independence has become a constant task for Till and his colleagues. Right before this public meeting in May, the DOE had been forced to make public additional classified documents relating to past radiation releases. While the new information was scary in itself, most people, including some on the steering panel, were more worried about what might still remain hidden.
How are we to know that these discrepancies are isolated to this one particular document and this one particular release?
We're still seeing the release of documents in 1989 that should have been released in the 1940s. This stuff should have been public information to begin with. The fact that we still have to go through this struggle in 1989 suggests that part of what lingers on about the Cold War is this relationship between the American government and its people.
Over the past few years, Norm Buskey and Linda Josephson have experienced this relationship firsthand. They are independent researchers concerned about radionuclides migrating from Hanford to the Columbia River. Refused permission to take groundwater and sediment samples on reservation property, they've been forced to work from the river, often with machine gun-toting security guards, making sure their feet never touch Hanford's dry shores.
They're probably as terrified of the public as the public is of nuclear weapons and some people of nuclear power. They're afraid that the public, if it finds out what they're doing, will not accept it, which may or may not be the case. The objective has been to produce nuclear weapons materials, and they have been trying to collect data that are supportive of that. They are cautious, they have a large budget, they have a lot of very highly trained people, and they know better than to go and look directly at something that might be a real problem. They sort of sneak up on it, and if it looks like a problem, they sort of sneak away from it.
Do you have my compass, Andy?
The DOE position is that the long-lived radionuclides do not migrate in the groundwater. What we have found is that they do. Their concept originally was it would take 1,000 years for the wastes to reach the river. It turned out that the answer was probably 3 or 4 years.
The DOE and its contractors have regularly taken groundwater samples and have developed sophisticated hydrologic models of the Hanford site. Though they refuse to acknowledge Buskey and Josephson's work, which has not been published in peer-reviewed journals, they have recently reduced their estimate of travel time to the river to 30 years.
The safety of those operations have to be demonstrated so that the American public can come in and take a look at it. And if they find one problem in our plant that we haven't already found in our self-assessment program and are working religiously to get it solved, then they've done us a favor. They're no longer the enemy. So investigators, inspectors general, state officials, come on in. And you can find something wrong, tell us, and you'll get a plaque.
Plaques are nice. But state of Washington officials wanted more when they and the EPA recently hammered out a Hanford cleanup agreement with DOE.
We felt we needed more than just a handshake, more than just verbal assurances. We needed a consent decree filed in court so we could enforce it legally. So that drove us to be real tough at the table because we couldn't frankly rely, the public wouldn't let us rely on such things as trust me. We ask no more of energy than the federal and state laws ask of any other citizen or industry in this country. And we have told energy we're going to hold them to the same standard.
Hanford has given us peace for 45 years. In other words, if they have more than half of the defense-related activity, then I consider them to have given more than half of the nuclear deterrence to the nation. And now we have to pay the piper.
Paying the piper is going to be expensive. At Hanford alone, cleaning up may cost $50 billion, more than the cost of putting a man on the moon. This will test the department's newfound concern for environment, safety, and health.
So Hanford then becomes one of our flagships. It'll be the waste management flagship, where we'll be super sensitive to the expeditious and cost-effective cleanup of waste throughout the nation.
As manager of environmental programs, Rick Wojtacek is a ranking officer on the Admiral's flagship. He knows better than anyone, perhaps, the magnitude of the job at Hanford. There are over 1,000 sites where radioactive wastes have been injected into the ground, poured into cribs, ponds, and trenches, or buried in drums and cardboard boxes. There are 9 idled nuclear reactors and 3 reprocessing plants awaiting decommissioning and decontamination. There are 11.4 million gallons of liquid waste stored in double-shell steel tanks that must be solidified in a billion-dollar vitrification plant still to be built. There's even 2,500 acres contaminated with radioactive rabbit droppings.
As I think about the job that we have to do here, the number of sites, we got 1,100 sites, and they go anywhere from something very small piece of chemical maybe spilt on the dirt to things that are hundreds of acres big. The job sometimes gets to be overwhelming. It's just, when you think of the size and the breadth and the amount of time it's going to take to clean the site up and the amount of money, it's really a big job.
The hardest part of that job will be cleaning up the original storage tanks. There are 149 single-shell tanks containing 46 million gallons of radioactive and toxic waste. Because 66 are confirmed or suspected leakers, almost all have had their liquids removed. What remains ranges in consistency from creamy peanut butter to concrete. To remove this material, remote mining techniques will have to be developed. The tanks are too dangerous for human entry. But before that billion-dollar-plus operation can begin, someone has to find out what's in each tank. It's not possible to say using existing records. This, too, must be done remotely. It takes just 15 or 20 seconds to connect the remote tank sampler. Nevertheless, given the levels of radioactivity in the tank, radiation protection is required for everyone in the vicinity. Chemistry on the sample itself can only be done behind 4-foot-thick leaded glass. It's going to cost $1 million per tank. Of course, everything the sample touches becomes radioactive waste. And since the new Hanford has promised to obey all disposal laws, and since there is no legal disposal site available, contaminated test tubes, beakers, and other tools are piling up in the next hot cell. The Department of Energy says it will take 30 years to deal with the mess at Hanford. 30 years and tens of billions of dollars. Even then, the area will require surveillance and monitoring for countless generations.
Today, in looking back, we had enormous transgressions against the environment. And the cleanup's going to be very difficult. And I don't think it's going to be realistic to think that we'll ever clean up the site back to pristine conditions, to where you can ever turn it back to the people.
The struggle to clean up Hanford will be mirrored by similar struggles at DOE weapons plants across the country. Key to all of these efforts will be the development of places to permanently dispose of radioactive wastes. The DOE has 2 repository projects currently underway. Both stand as challenges to Admiral Watkins' ability to improve DOE science and DOE public relations. The Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, or WIP, being built in a salt mine in New Mexico, is slated to receive DOE's long-lived alpha-emitting wastes. Some of these remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. Because these wastes are backing up not just at Hanford, but throughout the weapons complex, the Department of Energy desperately needs this facility open. Yet Secretary Watkins says the decision to open WIP is not a foregone conclusion and will be based on open inquiry into the facts.
The President asked me to come into this job to clean up a mess, dealing with the production reactors, the waste facilities, so that this nation could stand tall again on the peace through strength concept, which is what WIP is all about. What we've got here is one of the most important facilities in the nation. Not only is it important to the chain of events that have to take place in building a nuclear strategic deterrent arsenal, but it's also symbolic of our ability or inability to manage technology.
We've been studying this site now from the geologic, hydrologic standpoint since 1975. We know more about this site than is known about most other areas of comparable size in this country. We think that the waste will be disposed of safely here, not only for the immediate future, but for millennia to come.
But many outside the department aren't so sure. Roger Anderson, a geologist at the University of New Mexico, worked for a number of years as a consultant on the WIP project. Today, he is a member of an independent review panel that believes that the Department of Energy's assurances about WIP's suitability are premature, that the science being done there is far from unbiased, and in fact represents business as usual for the DOE.
When I joined that project, it was pretty clear that this was not primarily a research facility. This was a disposal project. Especially at the managerial level, the project is directed towards showing basically that this site is okay, that it's safe. This is really contrary to the basic tenet of science, which is that of disproof, of setting up an idea and then disproving it.
Anderson's review group believes this attitude has resulted in significant questions being glossed over. For example, questions about the seriousness of water seeping into the tunnels, water which shouldn't be there at all, and questions about the damage that may be caused by the presence of a high-pressure underground reservoir directly beneath the site. The DOE, on the other hand, believes such worries are exaggerated and the risks minimal.
I think to some extent we may be the victims of our own concern. We bend over backwards to institute safety measures, precautions, which in fact are perhaps gilding the lily. Might not really be needed in a totally practical, pragmatic world. But let's face it, out there in this world are people who are very concerned about these risks of nuclear waste. They're frightened of things that involve radioactivity. And over the years, we have tried to accommodate their fears by doing things that are so extreme to make sure there can be no possible consequence, that people then back off and they say, gee, if you're doing all these things, it really must be the most difficult job, the most hazardous stuff, the most touchy stuff you could possibly work with, or you wouldn't be doing all this. So I think, in some sense, the fact that we are bending over backwards to address these concerns helps feed the concerns.
Their wastes are piling up someplace, and if they want to put the waste underground in WIP and do it on the basis of a non-scientific decision, on a political decision, then our work as a review group would be essentially finished, and we would have to accept that result. But at least it wouldn't be using science in a way that says it's okay and convincing the public that this is basically a scientific project.
I've been down there to see the site, been down in the mines. It's beautifully engineered. It's well thought through. It's nearly ready. But it is not ready completely because the Department of Energy didn't do all their homework. Before, there was this arrogance and presumptive position taken by this department that we will put waste in WIP, irrespective of what the local feelings are. And I'm trying to erase that. That's the arrogance that we can't stand. This nation isn't built that way. And shouldn't be working that way.
If the Secretary has troubles at WIP, they pale in comparison to the potential furor that could erupt about the proposed repository at Yucca Mountain in Nevada. This is the only site being considered for the permanent disposal of those radioactive wastes that are the most dangerous to handle. These include not only wastes from DOE facilities like Hanford, but also tons of spent fuel from the nation's commercial power reactors. In fact, private utilities are helping to pay for Yucca Mountain research because they know nuclear power's future depends on solving the nuclear waste problem. Hoping to defuse opposition to the project, the DOE has promised a degree of openness that would have been unheard of in the past.
There's just a multitude of people watching what we're doing in a very wide open program. There's nothing classified on this program. We make all our reports available to the public. My office is wide open. Any member of the public can walk in and come and talk to the scientists on the project. So we hope by the openness and by the oversight, we will achieve some sort of public acceptance and confidence that we are doing the right things. I believe with all the oversight in the program, it can only be done correctly. It can't be done wrong.
DOE claims that there's now an openness at Yucca Mountain, that they will do it right. They have a lot of peer review and so forth. My experience with the DOE, it's somewhat sad and quite amusing, is that they are so used to doing poor science in this area that they are so habituated to screwing it up and doing it wrong, that they are screwing it up and doing it wrong, even in the glare of public inquiry.
Support for this position has come from scientists at the U.S. Geological Survey and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The complaint is that DOE science is inadequate, that as designed, the research program at Yucca will never resolve questions about even basic issues like groundwater movement and nearby volcanic activity. In November 1989, the DOE essentially admitted its critics were right. It agreed to throw out much of the $2 billion of work its 1,400 scientists and administrators have already done and start over. This decision is a serious blow to the nation's civilian nuclear power plants, which are running out of storage space for their spent fuel rods, and raises again questions about the DOE's ability to come to grips with the nuclear waste problem.
Can you trust an agency which is created an enormous nuclear mess of its own, and in the course of creating this mess have become de facto outlaws, be trusted to responsibly develop a permanent means to dispose of this? These are daunting questions.
The United States must have places to store nuclear waste. But before any repository is opened, a skeptical public must be convinced that such a facility can be built and run to an acceptable level of risk. At the same time, the public will be watching as the DOE cleans up Hanford and other dirty weapons plants around the country. The responsibility for getting all this done belongs to Admiral Watkins. His intentions appear to be good, but he is working within an agency that has earned the public's distrust.
The basic dynamic that has shaped and drove nuclear weapons policy decision-making has been one of an external threat. That is, we have to make sure that we can prevent nuclear war with the Soviet Union by outmatching them under the concept of deterrence. But what is happening now is that many people are beginning to fear that our government is more dangerous than the Soviets, and that an accident, for example, at a government nuclear weapons plant may be more likely than a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. And so that whole dynamic now is being shaped less and less by U.S. concern about Soviet threat and more about U.S. concern about a bureaucracy which doesn't seem to be under a lot of control. And Hanford is a microcosm of that.
Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS.